While it's not a sponsor, this audiobook review is brought to you by Hoopla. Go ahead and support your local library and see if Libby and or Hoopla are available through your local library. As for me, it was completely free. Alright, on to the review. Hey guys, it's Fate. So, pleasantly surprised. We just got done reading Moby Dick. This is a Moby Dick narrated by Pete Cross. And let me just open up by saying I am thoroughly surprised, I'm impressed and delighted, and I can tell that a lot of love went into the production that I just spent the last week consuming. So Moby Dick, as you know, is a classic novel between historic fiction, realistic fiction, sea novels, adult novels, etc. It is a very well-recognized book and a very long one, and one that I personally was afraid to even get started on just because of how many stories I heard from the last few generations of readers about its tendency to bore and confound its readers to the point of making them just drop the book and run. Even a bookworm of my own exact age was telling me that she had a similar experience with it, but that experience was something she had at a very young age, and she even was curious about reading Moby Dick. Now that I've been gushing about it, she's going to go back and check it out, and hopefully you'll be interested in checking it out too. As I said, this is narrated by a gentleman named Pete Cross. Pete Cross is apparently no small deal of an audiobook narrator, although he is a very humble guy. This is definitely his career passion, his absolute forte, if you will. Pete Cross has apparently had an interest in being a narrator since he was 11 years old. We are now decades past that whole initial foray into this interest. So at almost 24 whole hours long, Moby Dick has a huge cast of characters, a great deal of dynamic range, if you will, going from our onshore chapters all the way out to a long sea voyage. It's supposed to span across 3 years. A cast of up to 30 characters. There's definitely 30 shipmates, and several different interactions. Pete does a fantastic job going through a wide array of voices, and at first, I will be brutally honest, at first I thought, I'm not going to be able to get through this. I don't like the voices given to these characters. I don't like this narration. But as fate would have it, it came to be one of my favorite aspects of checking out this book. So we have a handful of main characters that are very different between Ishmael, the main narrating character, which I assume Pete more or less uses his average speaking voice for, as well as Captain Ahab, the infamous Captain Ahab, and his first, second, and third mates, as well as all of his harpooneers. What I will say is I was initially hit with the suspicion that these roles were being overacted and were almost too much, too overbearing, too grating, too eccentric, even campy or insane. But as time went on, I paid really good attention to the characterization of these roles and how important it was for both the symbolism and just getting the overall feel of the character across to act these roles so emphatically and so powerfully as Pete did. I even have on a note card here, narrator equals California theater twink ? If by some insane skew of happenstance Pete checks this out, I'm sorry for that. However, Ishmael does get a bit of a quirky, bright, and lighthearted voice, and both in the sense of how he sounds, as he is acted out as a character. And in how that character is in the book, which we'll touch on soon, it is actually wild how different his voice is and wild how different of a human being Ishmael is. For lack of a better word, at several occurrences, you will be struck with the feeling, man, Ishmael does not belong with these guys. He does not belong on this boat. He does not act, think, or sound like he belongs on this boat. However, he is in fact competent. He is just so different in philosophical depth as a person, you may say, compared to the rest of the cast. And Pete's innocuous voice for Ishmael, his harmless and almost bright and sunny voice, is actually very fitting for Ishmael symbolically, and as a character it fits with the role, the personality, and how almost Ishmael seems to be the personality trait of being a well-adjusted individual personified. But that's just a personal take. I will say that perhaps it is how innocuous and youthful of a voice Ishmael was given, but I kept feeling like, wow, Ishmael is a Victorian era, moist critical type guy. He is a character that is full of similes, metaphors, allusion, and all manner of comparison and reference. He's a very referential comparison maker. And it just screams moist critical, or Penguin Z0, however you want to call it. Like I was saying, the tonal modulation of the narrator is very deliberate. It's very helpful with following what can be rambling chapters. Chapters that are practical rambles lasting upwards of 20 minutes, just showing off the philosophical wanderings and comparisons and vast soliloquies that are made by characters, not just Ishmael, but absolutely Ishmael included. There are some scenes where the campiness and the perhaps overactedness seems like it has to stick out and it has to be a center point, a focus of the scene. There is, in fact, a chapter, I believe 40 in this edition of the book, where tons of unnamed sailors are supposed to be having a large, chaotic dialogue in the midst of a squall, and it was a bit hard to follow, and at times a bit cumbersome and a little grating. But that's where it came in handy that Pete Cross has the sort of narration style that he does. Like I said, I went back and forth between feeling like Pete overacted and oversold some of these voices, reeling it back in and saying, no, actually, in retrospect, perhaps that scene, perhaps that chapter really benefited from that, because his voice and his modulation, his absolute lack of monotone narration, the absence of monotone narration throughout this entire audiobook really helps you get through the 24 hours of Victorian prose, dialogue, diction, etc. that can just be an absolute turnoff for contemporary readers. All in all, Pete made me really smile, laugh, cringe, worry for the characters, etc., with how he was able to give so much soul to these written characters, these characters that would otherwise be existing only in a very complex text. And it's worth saying quite a lot that it takes a good deal of understanding the text, grasping the context, and having a very good grasp of historical and contemporary English to understand how to most intuitively give emphasis, flow, and connotation, or contextual, intonation to these words that are on the page. Pete does an absolutely stellar job of that. Go back, if you will, and read audiobooks from just any narrator at random. And the more you go back into Regency, Victorian, pre-contemporary works of literature, you will find that the sheer cumbersome nature, the hurdle of reading such uncommon diction in such strange and in some senses archaic or historical juxtapositions will trip up and confuse narrators to where their intonation and their flow don't sound natural or right. However, with Pete, this is not the case. This was never a complaint I had throughout this entire narration. You could say what you want about overacting or about certain voices being grating, but frankly, there is a lot of justification for that, and it is a absolutely minuscule flaw compared to places where you could mess up on Moby Dick. I wanted to state something that I should have mentioned earlier in the Pete introduction that I tried to do. Pete actually was nominated for an audiobook or narration award for the narration of Moby Dick, which is pretty huge. It was the SOVAS Award, or SOVAS, which is a Society of Voice Arts and Sciences. They nominated him for an award for this narration of Moby Dick. So I would say that if there is any audiobook for Moby Dick that you're considering checking out, this is absolutely got to be on your list. However, I will come to cement or possibly change that opinion as time goes on, because Moby Dick is such a staying piece of literature that I simply need to check it out again. I simply need to go in a little less blind and appreciate this book anew. That all being said, that being what we're about to cover, I want to give Pete's narration of Moby Dick a solid S as well. I would possibly bring it down to an A+ or an A, just because of how hard it was to listen to certain voices among the cast, and how some of the voices given to the cast are, possibly through Pete's best judgment, just a smidge over the top, at times where it didn't add enough to make the voices over the top. Maybe some of the accents likewise felt a tiny bit inconsistent, and it did irk me at the very beginning of the book. I have some notes here stating that characters seem to go between a Yorkshire and then a working class London accent, and other characters seem to have a strong nasal modulation, but then for no reason sound a little bit more like Ahab during this or that scene, which is not very much a nasally voice at all. But they are absolutely momentary flaws within the narration. So easily an A, possibly an S. I don't want to just be throwing out S's every time I read a 23 plus hour long audiobook, but I'll easily give Pete an A here. Talking about Moby Dick as a book, it is clearly a classic for many, many reasons. I will state that there are a couple flaws in terms of catching your attention and keeping your attention that would arguably make it less of a home run piece of media to consume. And it's less that the book itself is flawed and more that you just have to invest your own intention into it, your own desire to keep consuming the media, and your own patience with which you run back the text and review things on your own, spending a bit more of your own time to appreciate the literature better. Given that it is a very simile, metaphor, and allusion heavy text, you are going to just have to accept that depending on how versed in classics and biblical knowledge and historical knowledge and even Victorian sensibilities you may or may not be, that will determine how much of this you may or may not understand when Ishmael in particular is going on and making simile after simile, reference after reference. It is a bit tiresome. There will be times where Ishmael as a narrator is trying to tell you this story of what he is experiencing and how he feels for a character, feels about a situation. He will be referencing classical literature, famous mythology that you may or may not know, and biblical stories. It can get very tiresome, and if you want to know what the hell he's talking about, you just have to take a deep breath, run it back, maybe even take some notes, and then go look that crap up. It's very charming, but it has two sides to it. It can just as easily be extremely daunting and even alienating at times. It almost makes you feel stupid because why does this young man who's on a whaling ship just for funsies, why is that fellow so absurdly well read? It almost does something to your suspension of disbelief at times, but I like to think that Ishmael as a character has a very good justification for being so well read and so exposed to the classics and the philosophies, while also being a robust enough individual to have undertaken this voyage. There are many themes that are woven throughout this text, the most clear among them being the overarching theme of madness and a deterioration into madness, the pitfalls that one will fall into, will catch themselves in if they seek revenge, the flaws within human nature and differences in judgment and perspective and how those affect our interactions with those that we care about, love, and should be looking out for. If Ishmael is such a sensible individual and is not to be looked at as an eccentric, which is arguable one way or the other, because in a 2025 lens he seems extremely well adjusted and reasonable, whereas 170 years ago could have been very much an eccentric personality. If Ishmael is supposed to be seen as the well-adjusted and more enlightened individual, then this is a very progressive text, I have to say. There are many themes and relics of neurodivergence, queer and questionable queer interaction. There is a great deal of intermingling between dated and problematic ideals with shockingly progressive and contemporary humanist ideals. There is a bit of awareness toward the flaw in the whole undertaking of not just Ahab, but perhaps the whaling vessels themselves, and the critiques are present, albeit very subtle, toward things like whale oil and whaling. It's all quite remarkable and very interesting. And it's not me putting my own perspective on these things. It's actually coming from particularly Ishmael's perspective, where he shows how rather tragic and sad and bleak the outlook is for these individuals, and how accepting he is of these people who are so wildly different from himself. It is almost as though he has no notion of what should or should not be seen as normal in the first place, which is, again, a very progressive and open and shockingly worldly outlook on the matter. There are some passages and excerpts from the book that I just had to go and pull out and just show to people out of context, because some of the things going on in the book out of context are freaky. It's a freaky book at times. In fact, I would still say, despite how much I loved it and how dazzling it was and how interesting and poetic and philosophical it was, it was also just a freaky ass book. Like, apparently people felt that way back during the time it was released, but now for a whole different slew of reasons they feel about the same way, which is an interesting degree of staying power to stay so considerably freaky. That said, it is most certainly a book I will consider picking up again, perhaps another audiobook with another narrator, just to compare and contrast. That is going to be about it for today, though. It's been a lot of fun, and I'm going to go ahead and finally check out some media that is a little bit more contemporary and perhaps a bit more lighthearted. Thinking next time we'll take a friend suggestion or listener suggestion and go ahead and check out the left-right game. But that's going to do it for now, you guys. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening. Check out Moby Dick. Check out Pete Cross's narrations. Really cool stuff. And I am so glad that we were able to do this. All right, talk to you later. I guess it's going to be left-right game time next time.